I hope that your week is going well. Today we're diving into something that has piqued my curiosity for many years. Most people think a language is neutral. Most people also think that a language simply describes reality. He had a bath yesterday and he is super happy. So for some reason, he wants to be a part of this video. I hope it's alright because he has become quite attached to me now. Perhaps he'll always be in our videos. And why is this topic relevant, do you think? You use language to communicate with everyone you know? Doesn't matter the background, doesn't matter the interface. Whether in person, over the phone, through writing, like emails. If you work, you'd realize that most organizations spend enormous amounts of effort trying to reduce uncertainty. There's policies, procedures, reporting structures, approval chains, compliance, standardized communication, and of course the world of metrics, all created to reduce uncertainty. But at what point does reducing uncertainty becomes discovery? Organizations across the world need some form of control. Without it, planes crash, bridges may fail, money definitely disappears, and food becomes unsafe. Control, when used right, is useful and beneficial. You may even call it necessary. Because who wants food that's going to make them sick? No one. But do you know what I'm curious about? It's innovation. Because innovation often emerges from things that are quite messy. Think of things like experimentations, failure, disagreement, wandering thoughts, exploration, or even unexpected connections. But when we look at the underlying layers of all of this, you'll find something that you won't know until you step out of the different worlds that you're used to. For example, when I began learning languages, what became fascinating to me is that I noticed the pattern emerging across different areas, not just in organizations or technology or operations, but I started noticing it in language itself. Most people who speak one language often find themselves locked into the world of that language. If you speak English, then you interact with the English-speaking world from the time you're born to the time you leave the earth. Other people who speak a second, third, or fourth language expand the worlds that they live in. For example, there are roughly 7,000 languages spoken in the world today, estimated by linguists. And research shows that about half of those languages may disappear within the next century if the current trends continue. Did you know that not every language has a widely used writing system? Thousands of them are spoken, and far fewer of them are regularly written, meaning that a small number of languages dominate global communication, science, business, diplomacy, and the internet. Hundreds of millions of people speak English or Spanish or Portuguese or Arabic or Hindi or Mandarin or Russian or French and other major languages, while many other languages are spoken by only a few thousand people or even a few hundred. But here's where it gets interesting. Because when I look at the entire world of languages, I don't see just vocabulary. To me, language is a form of compressed intelligence. Why? Well, it's because every language is carrying some type of history, geography, or survival strategies. There's even social norms that are embedded and cultural priorities, which forms a way of categorizing reality. For example, A language that developed in the Arctic notices different things than one that developed in a rainforest. Or what about a language that evolved among sailors? They notice different things than the one that evolved around farmers. A language that evolved in a vast empire may encode different assumptions than one evolved among small communities. For example, the English language was formed using a method that was quite comfortable stealing words from other languages. Because the English language has borrowed words from Latin, Greek, French, Norse, the Germanic languages, Hindi, Arabic, Spanish, some indigenous languages, and countless others. English is basically the linguistic equivalent of someone walking through a buffet and saying, I'll take one of those, and one of those, and one of those, and then it's done hundreds of times. Here's another interesting observation. I've noticed that some concepts exist in one language and require entire paragraphs in another. And it's not because one language is smarter. It's because different groups of humans spent centuries paying attention to different things. For example, if you've spent your entire life inside one language, you often don't realize that your language is making assumptions. It feels normal, invisible, oblivious. Then you learn another language, and suddenly you think, wait, we don't even organize this idea the same way. But it doesn't mean that you're trapped in any way. It just means that those people often don't realize there are other maps of seeing the world. Imagine being born in one city, or one town, or one village. Now imagine living there your entire life. Then suddenly you discover there's about 6,999 other cities. It's not that the first city is wrong. It's just not the entire world that you live on. There are over 7,000 living languages in use today. It's 2026. And the number changes because researchers keep documenting languages, so the classifications shift. But the distribution is widely uneven. Ethnologue says that the top 200 languages account for over 88% of the world's population as native language users. So it just means that some humans live inside a reality which consists of a relatively small set of giant language worlds, while thousands of smaller language worlds carry knowledge that's local. Memory, humor, food, landscape, music, plants, maybe animals, rituals, and ways of seeing the world. And if you don't think this is important, UNESCO says that at least 40% of the world's languages are endangered, meaning that a language disappears on average every 2 weeks. That's 2 languages per month. But that's not just vocabulary disappearing. That's a living library disappearing and burning quietly. But not every language lives on a page. Some languages live in the mouth, in memory, in songs, in kitchens and ceremonies, in jokes. Also in directions for navigation and in stories told while someone is harvesting mangoes or even fixing a fishing net. But spoken is not the same as written. For example, in one language you may say, move to the left, while in another, the world may ask you, do you even know where north is? And it's these invisible walls we're exploring today. Because as the world of technology advances and gets embedded into every aspect of human life, the more these invisible barriers in the world of communication will create friction at some point or another. I know you're wondering why I say this. So far, nothing that I've said about the world of languages sounds like a problem. In fact, it sounds beautiful, especially considering there are thousands of languages, which means there are thousands of ways of seeing things, thousands of perspectives, thousands of ways of organizing reality itself. So where's the friction? When you look at the world of languages, you see that human language evolved for humans. Machine language evolved for machines. But what happens when we ask machines to understand the human languages? Think about this. For hundreds of years, humans evolved language, not for computers or for databases, nor for algorithms, not for voice assistants, not for AI, for humans. The species that's messy and emotional, distracted, and shares stories. Humans who point at things. For people who use sarcasm. And those who say one thing and mean another. Language evolved for humans who communicate with tone, facial expressions, pauses, eye movements, body language, context, history, shared memories, culture, and their own assumptions. Then one day, we created a machine and looked at it and said, good luck. Let's explore this using the English language. Because I think English is a beautiful language, but sometimes it's absolutely ridiculous. And I say this as someone who speaks English. But I also grew up speaking broken English. For examples, the words read and read, lead and led. What about wind and wind? Or bow and bow? What about tear and tear? These words are the same spelling, but they have different meanings. Because somehow, when English was designed, someone basically looked at its architecture and said, we don't need efficiency. No thank you. Or think about accents. If I say water, a Canadian will say the word one way. An American will say it another. A Caribbean person will say the word differently. A Scot will pronounce it differently. Someone from Liverpool will say it differently. Or Texas or India. Yet somehow, we're supposed to be speaking the same language until English has become English as a lingua franca. Now imagine being an artificial intelligent voice recognition system. It spends years training on millions of recordings. Then someone from somewhere rural on this planet appears. And the machine is suddenly like, I have concerns. And that's only English. Now multiply that by thousands of languages, thousands of dialects, thousands of accents, thousands of speech patterns, thousands of cultural assumptions, and thousands of ways of organizing reality. Because humans are astonishingly good at filling gaps. If your friend sends you a message with some missing words like, hey, can you grab the blank from the blank before we go to the blank? You'll probably figure it out. Humans do this constantly. We are living context machines, but computers are not. Computers need clues. Humans survive on assumptions. When I think about how often I switch languages to learn, It feels like I do it all the time. From English to Spanish, Portuguese, Russian, or Mandarin, and sometimes within the same conversation. My brain treats that as a normal Tuesday. But a machine sitting there might have a little existential crisis. And this is where we get into something fascinating. Imagine a brilliant scientist or an artist. What about an engineer or an entrepreneur or a farmer or an elder, storyteller? And imagine they speak with a strong regional accent or a dialect or a language that technology barely supports. And now imagine how fast systems are moving towards a future where most interfaces are voice-driven. There's voice search, voice AI, voice commands, voice navigation, voice education, voice healthcare, voice government services, voice commerce. So if the system struggles to understand that person, then who exactly has the limitation? Would you say the human or the technology? Because innovation often assumes everyone can access the tool. But then you ask, can they? Can they really? Or does the tool quietly favor certain accents or certain speech patterns? What about certain dialects or certain languages or certain educational backgrounds or certain regions or certain ways of speaking or certain demographics? Because here's the funny contradiction. The people who work behind the scenes of the internet promised to connect humanity. They even created AI, promising to help humanity. And it's amazing and brilliant to be living in a world today with these forms of technology. But if voice technology promises to remove barriers, and every one of those systems needs to pass through the narrow gate of language, then language may be one of the messiest inventions humans have ever created. Not because it's broken, but because it was not built for machines. It was built for us, for people telling stories around fires, for people falling in love, for people singing songs, for people telling jokes, for grandmothers explaining recipes that contain no measurements whatsoever. Add a little, she'll say. Or if you add too much, she'll say, no, not that little. Just try programming that. So the question changes from, can machines understand language? To, can machines understand humanity through language? Because the more I learn languages, the less I believe language is merely a collection of words. I see language as a compressed form of culture, history, memory, emotion, assumptions, and reality. And we're currently attempting to teach all of that to machines, which may be one of the most ambitious projects humans have ever undertaken. So I hope by now you realize that I'm no longer talking about language and its limitations. Because what I'm actually talking about is what gets lost when reality crosses a language boundary. Because that's where the fun facts live. For example, in English, the common phrase is to say, kill two birds with one stone. But when I started learning Russian, the expression is kill 2 bunnies or kill 2 rabbits with 1 shot. Or in German, someone may say, hit 2 flies with 1 swat. It's the same idea, but there's different animals and different ways of acquiring them, which makes you eventually think, why are all these cultures throwing things at different creatures? Here's another one. English speakers often ask, how are you? Most of the time, they do not want a full medical, financial, emotional, or spiritual assessment. Why? It's because it's simply a greeting or a social ritual. A machine has to learn that because the literal meaning and the practical meaning are completely different. Think about when someone says, I'm fine. Humans can hear if they're genuinely fine or they're slightly annoyed. They can even hear if they're extremely annoyed or sad or exhausted. And they can also hear if the person does not want to discuss something. But the machine hears. User reports being fine. Take, for example, when I meet people from across cultures, it's quite funny to see the similarities between common expressions or seeing different ways of saying thank you. For example, in the Vietnamese language, you'll probably notice when people speak English, they don't necessarily often say please. And that's because, built into the language itself, the word please, when translated, means to beg. And as you look at that social cue and replicate it across languages, you'll find that many languages handle politeness differently. English often relies on words such as please, thank you, and sorry. And the running joke is that Canadian English may be one of the world's leading exporters of sorry. Meanwhile, other languages may embed respect directly into grammar, or word choices, or honorifics, or relationship terms. And even in sentence structure, the respect is still there. It's just encoded differently. From my own experience speaking with different people across different countries in different languages, the one thing that becomes obvious very quickly is that translation is never just translation. Because the words arrive and the meaning sometimes arrives, but the culture is like it takes a connecting flight and shows up 3 days later. Here's another one. Many English speakers think thank you is universal. But the more you travel across the world of languages, you'll discover that entire cultures have different assumptions around gratitude, obligation, reciprocity, hospitality, hierarchy, family, friendship, and social distance. The assumptions do not always translate. Or think about food. Imagine explaining things like doubles in Trinidad or poutine in Canada. What about feijoada in Brazil or borscht in Eastern Europe? You can translate the ingredients, but can you translate the experience? The answer is not entirely, because part of the experience and the meaning lives in the culture. And what about humor? Because that's a massive one. And I'll share an example from my own life. One day I was using voice to text to make myself more efficient in the kitchen while I was trying a new type of grain. It's called farro. Farro. And I really wanted to try this grain because it's been cultivated for thousands of years and was eaten by ancient civilizations long before any of us were arguing with voice-to-text systems. So I started talking about Pharaoh. Except the software didn't hear Pharaoh. The software heard Pharaoh. So instead of discussing the food that I was making, I was apparently discussing ancient Egyptian rulers. And within minutes, I had gone from cooking grains to wondering about the Egyptian plagues, from frog populations, and whether someone accidentally discovered frog legs because of a national ecological crisis, which is a completely different recipe. But here's the interesting part. The machine misunderstood because language is messy, not because the machine is not useful. It's quite useful. Because to a human, the context was obvious. I was standing in a kitchen discussing ingredients. But humans immediately narrow the possibilities. Oftentimes, machines have to search a much larger library of possibilities. And sometimes the machine decides that an Egyptian ruler is more likely than food. Think about it. Every system is trained on data, and every dataset has strengths. But every dataset also has gaps. And it's those gaps that often reveal whose voices, industries, vocabulary, accents, and experiences were most represented during training. For example, a particular technology I love using might become incredibly good at celebrities or movies or politics, maybe common city names, and major brands, because those things appear constantly in public data. But where the gaps are is where the designers don't include things like local crops, regional foods, indigenous place names, farming terminology, or fishing terminology, or common community expressions. Because those may appear less frequently, the machine has less experience with them. So sometimes the machine can feel like it has the vocabulary of a teenager. So it becomes a fascinating question, because I'm not asking, is the machine smart? But I'm asking, which parts of reality has the machine seen most often? Because from what I've observed about humans, most have exactly the same problem. And we call it experience. So when we think about language, it's not necessarily a file format. Language in itself is an entire ecosystem. A perfect, ordinary human activity can turn into a different reality the moment the language crosses into the digital ecosystem. And it's at the end of this investigation where we find the limitations of innovation through language. This is where we ask, what happens when we build an entire digital civilization on top of it? Because if you really think about it, human civilization spent thousands of years creating languages. These languages evolved through trade, migration, war, poetry, love letters, songs, arguments, grandmothers, grandfathers, fishing villages, empires, farmers, and storytellers. And now, engineers in the digital world are handed this giant pile of human chaos and told, turn this into software. I say, good luck. Because if you think about the scale of this, imagine approximately 7,000 languages and one disappears every 2 weeks. That means thousands of dialects, thousands of accents, and billions of humans. And somehow we're expecting a machine to sit there and calmly say, Yes, I understand all of you. So you can see how here is where it gets interesting. Because innovation rarely arrives dressed like innovation. It usually arrives dressed like confusion. Think about every major idea. The first time someone suggested airplanes, or the internet, or smartphones, or podcasts, or electric cars, people thought they were strange. Something ridiculous and absolutely impossible. Until it happened. And that's because innovation often sounds wrong before it sounds obvious. And that creates a problem. Because most systems are very good at recognizing what they already know. And innovation is usually something they don't know yet. Imagine the first person in history describing a podcast. What are you even going to call it? A radio show? Not exactly. What about a recording? Not exactly either. What about a broadcast? It's not exactly that. And that's because the idea arrives before vocabulary. The language often has to catch up. Or think about AI. Think about 5 years ago. How many people were casually discussing things like prompt engineering or large language models? What about multimodal systems or AI companions? It would have been very few people. That's because the concepts arrived and then the vocabulary followed. You were noticing language expanding in real time. And this is where we return to the machine. Because a machine can only categorize what it recognizes, meaning that a machine can only recognize categories that exist. But humans create new categories. That's one of our superpowers. We're constantly inventing new ways to describe reality. Sometimes we invent new technologies. Sometimes we invent new businesses. Sometimes we invent new art. And sometimes we invent new words. And that's why I find this so fascinating, and I hope you do too. Because the limitation isn't intelligence. The limitation is translation. Think of it like this. The machine is trying to understand reality through language, and humans are trying to describe reality through language. But reality itself refuses to sit still. To see this, let's take something simple. If I say the word cloud, would you think I'm talking about weather or data storage, photography, computing, a shape, or a memory? Humans usually know, but machines have to investigate. Let's take something even funnier, the world of slang. If I say, that's sick, does it mean I'm dying? Or I'm impressed? Or am I concerned? Or am I excited? Or am I 15 years old? I wish the machine good luck. And this is where we reach the really interesting part. The future, as we innovate and progress, may not be limited by processing power or storage or internet speed. But the future will be limited by interpretation itself. Because the challenge is no longer can the machines hear us? The challenge is can the machines understand what we actually mean? And those are very different problems. This is exactly why language continues to fascinate me. I see every language as a living museum. It's like a survival guide or a comedy club. Sometimes there are recipe books in there. And it's full of history, navigation system, It's also a social contract, and it's a memory bank. Each language has its own world view, hiding inside ordinary words. And now humanity is attempting to teach all of that to machines. They're trying to teach not just the words, but the meaning. But the meaning requires context, and the context requires humanity. If we succeed, it may become one of the most extraordinary engineering achievements in human history. And if we fail, well, Pharaoh becomes Pharaoh. Dinner becomes archaeology. And somewhere in the background, a machine may think, why are humans so complex and confusing? See you in the next one.